Hi, this is Dr. Golding, and today we're going to continue our class on Aristotle's ethics, which is really to say Aristotle's theory of virtue. Okay, so last time we talked about Aristotle's theory of the good or the highest good. The highest good is human happiness. And we said that we didn't really get a clear definition yet as to what happiness is. But I brought up the question of whether there is an objective definition, like a true, genuine definition of what human happiness really is. And Aristotle believes that there is an objective fact as to what human happiness consists in, despite the fact that people are, very different from one another in certain ways. But basically all humans are the same. According to Aristotle, we have the same human nature. And because we have the same human nature, we basically have the same makeup and the same basic desires and drives. And therefore, ultimately, Aristotle is going to argue that happiness is what it is for all humans, even though there may be some room for some variations. We'll get into that. But today I am going to talk primarily about something called the function argument. I am going to, or I may have already sent you some notes for today on the function argument. So I'm not going to be writing a lot on the board today because I've sent you some notes to follow the lecture today. So these are the main topics for today. The function argument, we're going to talk a bit about intellectual virtue and then practical virtue. So basically we're going to see that according to Aristotle, virtue falls into two parts. There's two parts of virtue. There's intellectual virtue and then there's practical virtue. And really we're going to spend next time getting into more detail on practical virtue, but I'll just sort of touch upon it today. So these are the main things for today. Now, before we get to this thing that I'm calling the function argument, Aristotle does mention, he has a little discussion of happiness before he gets to the function argument. In particular, he talks about how there are some different theories out there as to what happiness is, okay? There's some different views, different theories about what human happiness is. And he says that he talks about three theories of happiness, and then he says in a way that all of these theories are mistaken or only partly true. So let's just go through that first. So I did not send you any notes on this, so you might want to take some notes on what I'm about to say now, if you wish. There's three popular, well, some are more popular than others. There's three conceptions of what human happiness consists in that are out there in the world, okay? And I, by the way, think there is some truth to this very day. There's these three views out there, at least three. So, first of all, there is the view that we might call the hedonistic view of happiness. Hedonistic, right? We've talked about hedonism before. Hedonism has something to do with pleasure, right? The word in Greek for pleasure is hedone. And so the hedonistic conception of pleasure, the hedonistic conception of happiness, the hedonistic conception of happiness is that essentially a happy life is a life that is a pleasurable life, and an unhappy life is going to be a life that has pain or a lot of pain. Okay, so, one of the questions we could talk about, by the way, is, are there degrees of happiness? Can you be somewhat happy, a little more happy, very happy, totally happy? And I think a lot of people would agree that happiness comes in degrees, and the hedonistic conception of happiness would also go for that, because basically, according to a hedonistic conception of happiness, the more pleasure you have in life, the more happier you are, or the more happy you are. The more pain your life has, the more unhappy you are in your life. So Again, I'm not saying that this is a correct view of happiness. Aristotle is going to reject it, but the hedonistic conception of happiness is that a happy life is basically a pleasant life. An unhappy life is a painful life, and many hedonists would be thinking of particularly physical pleasures. There may be other kinds of pleasures as well, but for now you can think of pleasure as mostly a physical experience of some sort. Okay, so according to the hedonistic conception of happiness, a pleasant life is a happy life, and a painful life is an unhappy life, and the more pleasure you have, the happier you are. The more pain you have in your life, the more unhappy you are. Okay, Aristotle says this is probably one of the most common views you find out there in the world as to what happiness consists in. That's one view, and Aristotle is going to reject it. We'll come back to exactly why in a moment or two, but let's talk about popular view, or maybe this is not as popular, but it's out there. There is the view that a happy life consists in a life of honor or achievement or name recognition, basically fame and fortune, in the sense of becoming, like, not necessarily famous, but kind of making a name for yourself. Okay, a lot of people feel that that is going to make them happy, right? That a happy life would be a life in which you make a mark on your world, that you get to be known as an entity. You establish yourself. You have a reputation, maybe as a fine, upstanding member of community, or for some people, a reputation might be as, being a gangster or being an outlaw. People sometimes look at that as a way of gaining fame and name recognition. Okay, so there is the view out now. This is different from the first view, right? The first view is hedonistic. It's all about pleasure versus pain. This view is, no, it's not about pleasure or pain. It's about name recognition or honor. And so, of course, in many cases, to achieve reputation or to make a name for yourself, to gain that kind of honor, it could be painful, right? It's not necessarily many people who are famous, although they may have a lot of money, don't necessarily live a very pleasant life, because it takes a lot of pain and suffering and putting yourself out there to maybe reach that level of fame or name recognition. So these are two different views: the hedonistic conception of happiness versus the conception of happiness as consisting in a life of honor or name recognition. That's number two. Now, a third view Aristotle talks about, again, we're talking about views of happiness before we get to what's on the board over here, but a third view regarding happiness that Aristotle speaks of is what he calls the philosopher's view. Now, it's interesting because Aristotle himself is a philosopher, but the philosophic view of happiness, or the intellectualist view of happiness, is that a happy life is a life that is devoted to the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. Okay? Aristotle apparently attributes this view to Plato, his own mentor, that, he saw Plato as a very intellectualist type of a person who regarded the intellectual life, the pursuit of philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom and understanding, using the intellect to gain knowledge, that is what makes for a happy life for the human being, okay? Now, Aristotle says that all of these, by the way, that last view would be the least popular, right? It's interesting to point out that these three conceptions of happiness, hedonistic, life of honor, recognition, and the intellectual life, the conception of happiness as consisting in the intellectual life. These three conceptions of happiness correspond to the three parts of the soul, according to Plato. Remember, we have the appetite, that's the lowest level of the soul, according to Plato. Then you have spirit, which is, that's supposed to be associated in the ideal state with the guardians, with the soldiers who are into courage, and maybe a little bit of courage is sometimes associated with kind of putting yourself out there and making a name for yourself in a way. It's not an easy life, it's not a pleasant life to be a soldier, but it may bring you some name recognition or honor, and maybe that's one reason for why some people do go into the military. I don't know. That's probably not the case for many people who go into the military in our country. There may be other reasons, economic reasons, but anyway, the third part of the soul is the rational part. The highest part of the soul is the rational part of the soul, which engages in intellectual study. So basically, each of these three conceptions of happiness correspond to one facet of the soul. And here's what Aristotle says. Aristotle says, all of these views, these three views, there's some truth to them because each one of these views involves some aspect of the human being. The problem or the flaw with each of these three views is that each of these views takes one aspect of the human and then says this is what the human being is all about. Okay, so Aristotle would agree, yes, I have an intellect, I have spirit, and I have appetites. I'm interested to some degree in having pleasure and avoiding pain. I'm interested in, to some degree, making some kind of achievement, making a mark on the world and having some kind of, name recognition. That to some degree, every human is in some way or other, focused on that. And third of all, and in a way, Aristotle agrees that of the three, this would be the most important component of happiness, would be living an intellectual life. But none of those three views are correct because they each take one aspect of the human being and then blow it out of proportion. And so basically, to describe Aristotle's conception of happiness is, and we're going to get into that more today, and that's part of what the function argument is going to get us into, is a little more understanding of what Aristotle thinks happiness is. But for now, we can say that happiness for Aristotle is the well-being of the human being, okay? When a human being has well-being overall, and that's going to include not just physical health and not just mental health, but certain kinds of activities that are associated with what it is to be a human being, and we're going to get into that in the function argument. Okay, but for now what we're saying is that Aristotle has what we might call a holistic, the word holistic is spelled H-O-L-I-S-T-I-C. Aristotle has a holistic conception of what human happiness is. It includes many, many things. It includes living an intellectual life. And actually for Aristotle, that's going to be the most important part of a happy life, and we'll see why shortly. But it includes living an intellectual life. It includes the pursuit of name recognition to some degree. And it does also include the pursuit of pleasure overall and avoiding pain. But basically what we're saying is that according to Aristotle, a happiness has to do with the flourishing. That's another word we can use to describe Aristotle's conception of happiness. It's sort of like if you think about, last time we talked about teleology and the idea of a, teleology in action. We gave the example of an apple seed turning into a beautiful blossoming apple tree. So we can think of that as this is a little bit incorrect, but apple seed happiness. When is an apple seed happy? when it flourishes and reaches its full bloom, blossoming, wonderful, beautiful apple tree, realizing its potential insofar as it is the kind of thing that it is. Remember that the telos of a given object is always fixed and suited to the nature of that particular thing. Okay, so for now we can say that according to Aristotle, human happiness is going to have something to do with the flourishing, the full actualization of one's potential as a human being. Okay, now again, in order to get some more detail on that, we're going to now move to the function argument. And in the function argument, and this is the this involves the notes that I sent you. I have put down in a series of 6 steps. Okay, and by the way, if you did not get this handout and you would like to get one, please feel free to email me and I'll send you this thing. So if you do have access to it right now, you might want to pull it up so that because we're gonna go through this argument, the function argument, step by step. Now, I did not make this name up. This is a name that other philosophers have already used to describe Aristotle's argument. Now, what this, basically what we're gonna go through here, what Aristotle's target is he's trying to pin down, come up with a definition of what is human virtue, right? This is the main question in ethics. What is virtue? And then there's some related questions like, why should we be interested in it? What's the motivation for behaving virtuously? Those are the 2 main questions that we're talking about, at least in this class, right? So in this argument called the function argument, Aristotle is going to try to make a claim about what virtue is, essentially the heart of what virtue is. And then we're going to see after that, that according to Aristotle, there's going to be 2 branches of virtue. One's called intellectual virtue, and one is going to be called practical virtue. There are other names for these branches, but there's 2 main branches of virtue according to Aristotle. One's going to be called intellectual or theoretical virtue. The other one's called practical virtue. And we're not going to spend too much time today on practical virtue. That's going to be the topic of our next lecture. But let's go to the function argument. So if you have the handout, pull it up. Let's start with step number 1. There's steps here, and there's essentially each of these steps Aristotle either thinks is rational off the top of your head, or we can give a little argument for it. But let's look at step number 1. So I'm holding the handout in my hand. Number 1, a thing or a creature has virtue, quote unquote. Now, well, let's just read through this. A thing or a creature has virtue if it performs its function, and I put in the Greek word for function there is ergon. If it performs its function well and on a regular basis. Now, what does the word ergon mean? Ergon means a characteristic activity, or as we would say in English, a function. Now, let's go back to the word virtue. We've talked about this word before. The word virtue is really a Latin-based word. Aristotle did not use the word virtue. He would have used the word arete, A-R-E-T-E, right? Arete in Greek is virtue. Now, another translation of that word arete, I guess I'll write that on the board in case you want to get that down. Okay, this is the Greek word for virtue. It is arete, A-R-E-T, and then a little slash over the last D to indicate it's not pronounced arete, but arete. Okay, so arete is sometimes translated as excellence. All right, excellence. That's what it is to be virtuous in some sense. Like if I say, oh, that's a virtuous person, what I mean is in effect that that is an excellent person. That person is a fine person. Okay, so think of the word arete as excellence. Think of virtue as a kind of excellence. Well, if you think of it that way, then number one makes a lot of sense, right? A thing or a creature. Now, it could be a car. It could be, Aristotle actually gives the example of a flute player or someone who plays a musical instrument. I think he talks about a lyre player, not a liar who lies, but lyre, L-Y-R-E. Anyway, let's just stick with flute because the word lyre has bad connotations. So we're going to stick with the example of a flute player, okay? Think about a flute player. When do you call a flute player an excellent flute player? Well, when he performs the function of a flute player well. Now, in the case of a flute player, it's pretty easy to say what is the function of the flute player. The function of the flute player is obviously to play the flute. So that's an easy example where we can see, okay, when do we say that so-and-so is an excellent flute player? When he or she plays the flute well, then we say that that is an excellent flute player, right? When they play it well and on a regular basis, that's actually an important clause there. If someone gets up and plays the flute well by accident, or, every other day or every other week, sometimes when they play the flute, wow, that sounded really good, but then other times they don't sound very good. They can't play the flute very well, then we would say that that is not an excellent flute player, right? I'll use another example. Let's talk about basketball, okay? What makes for an excellent basketball player? Well, obviously, the function of a basketball player is to play basketball, right? And to do it well, now we all know, more or less, if you know the game of basketball, you know that part of playing basketball well involves shooting buckets, right? Having a good shot, being able to, there may be different skills that are associated. Some people are better at certain things than others, right? Some people are really good at the outside shot. Some people better going toward the hoop. There's defensive. There's people who block shots. There's a whole range of activities that are involved in playing basketball well. So a really excellent basketball player would be somebody who fulfills the function of a basketball player well, and the more qualities that the basketball player is able to excel at in terms of basketball skills, the better a basketball player he or she is going to be, right? So let's just talk about one more example. When do we say that a car is an excellent car? Well, we have to have some idea of what is the function. Now, that word function, characteristic, activity, the function of a thing, or the ergon, is the activity that that thing does, given that it is the kind of thing that it is. Okay, they may sound a little bit wordy or kind of confusing, but the idea is that, an ashtray, what makes for an excellent ashtray? Well, ashtrays don't actually act a lot. They don't have to do a lot, but a good ashtray or an excellent ashtray is going to be one that fulfills the function of an ashtray, does it well and on a regular basis, right? So if you have an ashtray that's made out of paper or some kind of flimsy material, that's not going to be a very good ashtray because it's going to catch on fire. It's not going to catch the ashes, and so on. A good car, let's go back to the example of a car. What is the function of a car? Well, the function of a car is not to go on water, right? If you take your car out and you try to drive it across the lake and it drowns and you say, oh, that was a bad car because it drowned, well, that would be foolish because the function of a car is not to go on water. It's to go on land. The function of a car is not to fly in the air like an airplane, right? If an airplane, an airplane can be a great airplane, but it's not going to be a good boat necessarily, right? So you always judge, this is the important point here, that in order to make a judgment about whether a thing is or is not excellent, insofar as it is what it is, then you're going to have some idea of what is the function, what is the characteristic activity of that thing. Okay, that's number one. And then you're going to ask yourself, does this entity or thing perform that function well and on a regular basis? And if it does, then it is going to be an excellent whatever it is, right? An excellent car, an excellent basketball player, an excellent flute player, an excellent ashtray, right? As long as it does what it is supposed to do on a regular basis and it does it well, then it's going to be called an excellent whatever it is. Okay? Now, how do we determine? That's step number one. If you have any questions or if you find that confusing, please, make a note and we can take up any questions at another time. But let's move on to number two. Number two says the function or ergon of a thing is determined by its essence or defining nature. Okay, basically what we're saying here is that according to Aristotle, any given thing has a nature or a definition as to what it is, okay? A definition or a defining nature is those properties that are unique to that kind of thing that are not possessed by other things. Okay, so the definition of a square is that it has 4 straight sides that are equal and 4 internal right angles. That is the definition of a square. So the definition of a thing is, as you know, a description of the properties that that thing has uniquely and that other things do not have. Okay, so that's what makes a square different from a triangle is, well, the square has 4 sides and 4 internal right angles, and that makes it different from a triangle or from a rectangle even, because the sides of a rectangle are not all equal. Anyway, what we're saying here in number 2 is that function, if you want to know what the function of a given thing is, you have to know the definition of that thing. So, like maybe Aristotle would say something like, in the examples I gave you, it's very easy, like, what is the function of an ashtray? Well, that follows directly from the definition of an ashtray, right? An ashtray is an object that is designed to be something that catches the ash of people who smoke. It may also serve the function of catching, being a resting place for your cigarette or pipe or whatever you're using to your vape pen or whatever you use. I don't know if you need an ashtray for the vape pen. I guess there's no ash. Anyway, all right, so the function of an ashtray is determined by its definition. What is a car's function? Well, you have to know what the definition of a car is. The definition of a car is a vehicle that is designed to drive, get you from place to place within some reasonable amount of time and in a reasonable amount of comfort, right? So the definition of a car is going to be what determines what the function of that thing is. Okay, that is step 2. Definition of a basketball player, someone who plays basketball. And then you have to know a little bit about what is the definition of basketball and what is the game of basketball and how you score points and how you win. Okay, so in order to know what an excellent basketball player is, you're going to have to know the definition of the game basketball, and then that's going to translate into what makes for the function of a basketball player. Okay, so I hope that's clear. That's step number 2. Function is determined by essence or defining nature. And again, remember, defining nature means those properties that a thing has that makes it be what it is. Okay, now here comes step 3. This is a very important step. All the steps are important, but in step 3, Aristotle is making a very important claim. Step 3 says that if we talk about a human being, we've talked about cars, we've talked about ashtrays, basketball players, we've talked about other kinds of things that you can judge as to whether they are excellent or not. But let's talk about a human being. Does the human being, here's an important question, does the human being have a defining nature? Is there an essence that is defines what a human being is and sets apart, because that's what a definition is supposed to do, a definition sets apart the thing that it's defining from anything else, right? So Aristotle says, yes, not only is there, he's going to claim that there's a function, there is a characteristic activity that human beings are supposed to engage in, a characteristic activity or an ergon. Human beings have an ergon, and that ergon is determined by the essence or defining nature of the human being. Now, what is the defining nature of the human being? So Aristotle says, well, you can't say that the definition of a human is that we are a living creature, right? Because that includes other things as well aside from humans. So living creature is not good enough. Reproducing creature is not a definition of a human. Growing, propagating, those are true of animals as well as humans. So, and to some degree, those, growing and reproducing is true of vegetables, right? Of plant life. So, what is the essence of the human being? Aristotle says it is that we are rational animals. Okay, we are animals. And now notice, if you have the handout, you'll see that I underlined and bolded the word rational. Okay, because Aristotle would say that, we are animals. That's true. The human being is a living creature. We move around, we eat, we reproduce, we do things that other animals do. But what's unique, what's special, what is the quintessential definitional quality of the human, according to Aristotle, is that we are rational animals. Okay, we're rational animals. Okay, now that is the definition, the defining essence of what a human being is, according to Aristotle. Now, there's a lot of questions we can ask about this, and for some of you, this may be a point of possible potential criticism. Is rationality the essential defining human trait? We can talk about some objections to that. I guess I do want to say one thing is that, some people might say, well, wait a second, other animals are also rational. That's an objection that someone might make, or maybe you're thinking that. What about dogs? What about dolphins? What about, some people even might go so far as to say that trees are rational. But, let's just stick with the example of dogs or dolphins. Dogs sometimes are very, very smart. Certain animals seem to be very, very clever and the sly fox, right? They're able to play tricks. Monkeys, apes, okay. So that's a good question, and this really, a full discussion of this could probably take, a long discussion, lecture and discussion about are animals, non-human animals that we know of, are they really rational? There's a very, big debate about in what sense are animals rational. So the first thing to keep in mind here is that Aristotle's going to say there's a qualitative difference. I mean, a big qualitative difference between the rationality of the human being versus the rationality of animals. And we're talking as a species, okay? As a species, humans are much more intelligent and much more rational than even the smartest, cleverest monkey or dolphin. You don't find, as a rule, even the most clever apes. As a species, they don't go to university. They don't write books. They don't read books. They don't engage in philosophical reflection, at least not to the same degree that human beings do, okay? They don't come up with theoretical physics. They don't have universities. They don't have schools. at least they don't have schools with books where people talk and read and communicate in words. Now, you could try to argue against this if you would, but we're gonna move on here because again, I admit this is a point of possible criticism against Aristotle's view. But Aristotle would say that there is a serious qualitative difference between the level of rationality that humans have, and if you want to call it rationality, that dolphins or apes have. So what is the essential defining nature of the human being, according to Aristotle, is that we are extremely, if you want to put that in, qualitatively superior in some sense as rational animals. That is what is unique to the human being. Okay, so now if that is, let's just proceed. That was step number 3, and now moving to step 4. So step 4 says the function of a human being is to live a rational life or engage in rational activity. This follows from 2 and 3 put together. Okay, if the defining nature of the human is rational animal, and we said before that the function of a given thing is determined by its essence or defining nature, that's what we said about cars, basketball players, ashtrays. The function of a thing is determined by its defining nature. Then it follows that based on step 3 and step 2, you put that together, the result is step 4, that the function of a human being is to live, because a function is always an activity of some sort. So to engage in the characteristic activity that is unique and special to the human being is to engage in living a rational life, rational activity. Okay, I say living a rational life because we want to try to capture the fact that we're not just rational, we're also animals, okay? We have an animal nature. And so Aristotle doesn't deny that animality is part of our nature. We are rational animals. And so our function, our characteristic activity, insofar as we are the creatures that we are, is to engage in the living of a rational life. I'll remind you that the word animal comes from animus, which means living or life. It can also mean soul in Latin. Animus. Oh, that's actually in Greek too. Animus, anima. That's a Greek word as well. So, living a rational life is the characteristic activity or function of a human being. And now we can move to step 5. Therefore, it follows from this that what is human virtue? Excellence. What does it mean to be an excellent insofar as, what does it mean to be an excellent human being? Insofar as you are a human, insofar as you are the very thing that you are. What is human virtue? Aristotle believes there is such a thing as human virtue. Excellence insofar as one is a human. Well, you're going to have virtue if you live a rational life, if you do it well and on a regular basis. Okay, this is basically putting together steps 1 and 4. Okay, a human being has human virtue if he or she lives a rational life well and does it on a regular basis. Okay, so you could have, now just going back to, we're going to have to get, well, let's move on to step number 6, which is, step number 6 in a way is just rewording step number 5. So on the sheet I wrote down, that is to say, here's step 6, human virtue consists in those character traits which cause or allow a person to live a rational life, to do it well and on a regular basis. Okay, Aristotle is going to claim that there are certain character traits, and we'll talk more about what these character traits are specifically, but there are certain character traits which you as a human being have the opportunity to cultivate, to acquire certain character traits. There's going to be bad character traits and then there's going to be virtues. There's a whole bunch of virtues, specific character traits that are good for you to have. The reason why they're good for you to have is because if you have them, you are going to be able to exercise your function as a human being, to do it well and on a regular basis. And what is the function of the human being? It is to live a rational life. Now we're going to have to get into some more detail. The next question in your mind should be, and I have this on the sheet coming up, what does it mean to live a rational life? How do you do that? What's involved in living a rational life? What does that mean for Aristotle? Okay, what's involved in rational activity? We're going to get to that very shortly, but I wanted to just go back for a second and say that, you could have, I talked about before, a virtuous basketball player. Insofar as a person is a basketball player, they could be an excellent basketball player, but they still could be a rather rotten person as a human. Okay, you could have someone who's a very, very excellent basketball player, but they're very, very rotten as a person. Now, I think that, just thinking to some of the things that people say in the basketball world, some of the announcers, they would argue perhaps that to be a really good basketball player, you have to have some human virtue as well. Like, for example, you have to be sharing and caring, and you have to, think about the team and not just about yourself and so on. So it could be argued that to be a really excellent basketball player, you also have to be excellent as a human. But, okay, I'm imagining in theory, you can certainly have someone who's a very good, like a sharp shooter who shoots, three-point baskets very, very well, but they don't have in general, in the rest of their life, they're not living a very rational life, according to Aristotle. So what's more important, to be an excellent basketball player, or let's say an excellent tailor, or an excellent marksman, right? You could have someone who's an excellent marksman. They're very good at fulfilling the function of a sharp shooter. Okay, but they could be very bad as a human, because they could be, let's say, maybe killing people indiscriminately, or using their marksmanship to just take pot shots at people. So they would be a very good or excellent marksman, but a very bad human being. Okay, and Aristotle would certainly say that when you ask yourself, well, what's more important for me to be? The more important thing, obviously, Aristotle would say, is to be a good human, because that's who essentially you are. Right? All those other roles that you may adopt, a tailor, a marksman, a basketball player, those are not part of the definition of what it is to be a human, right? We would not want to define a human as a basketball player, or as a marksman, or as a tailor, or as a teacher, or as a doctor, right? Because that would be a bad way to define a human, because there are many, many, many humans that are not marksmen, or doctors, or basketball players, or teachers. So there's certain adopted roles, like playing a flute. Okay, that's an adopted role that you can choose to take on or not take on, right? So Aristotle would say that the thing that we should be trying to do with our lives is live an excellent human life. Not worry so much about, am I an excellent tailor, an excellent basketball player? I mean, that might be important for us in certain ways, but the main thing we would want to do when it comes to virtue is live an excellent life as a human. Okay? And again, according to Aristotle, all human beings have the same essential nature, that we are rational animals. And that's the definition of the human species, according to Aristotle. So living a rational life is going to be what it is for a human to be virtuous. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And it's not just living a rational life. It's living a rational life on a regular basis and doing it well. That is the character traits that will allow us or cause us to do that. That is what virtue consists in. Okay, now, when we have our discussion, we can discuss whether we agree or disagree with any or all of these premises. Again, there's really 4 premises, and well, there's really 1, 2, 3. Step 4 follows from 2 and 3, and then you've got step 5, which follows from 1 and 4. I'm looking at my sheet, and then 6 is the grand conclusion. Human virtue consists in those character traits that cause us or allow us to fulfill our function well, to live a rational life, to do it on a regular basis. Okay, that is the ends of the function argument. And now we have to talk more, in the remaining time, we're going to talk about, okay, what is involved in living a rational life, doing it well and on a regular basis? Okay, good questions. Aristotle says, and this is a very important point, that there are 2 uses or 2 ways in which we can use reason or rationality. Okay, this is a very important point for Aristotle, that rationality or the intellect, reason, we have 2 main uses that we can put reason, that we can apply with reason. Okay, now what are those 2 uses? They're names for them. There is the theoretical use of reason, sometimes called the intellectual use of reason. Theoretical, intellectual, and sometimes this is called the pure use of reason. That's one way in which we use reason. And then there is something called the practical or applied, impure use of reason, okay? Theoretical use of reason versus practical reason. Okay, let's try to get a grip on what these 2 uses of reason are. According to Aristotle, the theoretical use of reason or intellectual use of reason, this is employed when we use reason to know or to seek to know the truth. Period. Okay, when you use reason to learn, when you engage in thought, when you engage in reflection, or when you use your mind to try to understand what is true, because that's, according to Aristotle, one of the functions of reason. What reason is what? It's the intellect, the mind. The mind has a sort of function, which is to engage in the pursuit of truth. Okay, now that's the pure use of reason, using reason to gain knowledge. I did put down on the handout, using reason to gain knowledge of the truth for its own sake. Now, what I mean by that, or what Aristotle means by that, is simply that, let's suppose you're curious about a certain subject matter. You don't have any, something you're trying to get out of it, like, you want to know something in order to make money. No, you can use reason let's suppose for some reason you're curious about 17th century European history. Suppose you're curious about 17th century European history. So you can, say, I just want to know about what happened in the 17th century in Europe. So you start taking out books from the library. You start watching videos on the internet or watching films about 17th century Europe, and you're just using your mind to acquire knowledge, because that's it. There's no ulterior motive for why you're doing it. You're just using reason to pursue knowledge of the truth, in this case about a particular subject matter. So that is one use of reason. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute, but let's talk about the other use of reason. The practical use of reason, the practical, or sometimes it is called the applied use of reason, this occurs when we use reason to guide our actions and or control our emotions. Okay? The practical use of reason is when we use reason to guide our actions or control our emotions. So, for example, here's an example of the practical use of reason. Okay, let's suppose I'm hungry and I want to eat lunch. And I sit down and I try to figure out, where should I go for lunch? Should I go to the cafeteria? What do they have at the cafeteria? How expensive is that? What if I go over to Kroger's and buy something? Maybe I'll go to Wendy's. Maybe I'll go to McDonald's. Maybe I'll go somewhere else. I use reason. That would be an example of using reason to try to figure out where to go to eat because I'm hungry and I want to eat something. And I have all sorts of other calculations in my head about why I should or should maybe not go to a certain place. Okay, that would be using reason in its practical application. Okay, or if, for example, suppose I'm calculating I'm trying to figure out how much money do I have in my bank account because I want to buy, I don't know, I want to buy a TV, and this TV is a little expensive. And so I have to figure out, well, how much money do I have in my account? So I start doing some calculations and mathematics. I bought this, I bought that. How much money do I have? Can I afford this? Can I not afford it? Well, you're using reason, but there you're using it as a practical tool to try to figure out what to do. Should I buy this TV or not? Should I go out for lunch or should I eat in? Should I go to the cafeteria? Okay, so that's a lot of what we do when we use reason, right? We use reason many times to decide whether or not to do something. That is what Aristotle calls the practical use of reason. You're not using reason just to know for its own sake. Well, how much money I'm curious how much money I have in my bank account. In the example I gave, you're using reason to try to figure out what to do. Okay, now I mentioned, or Aristotle says, practical reason also involves using reason to control one's emotions. So, I mean, I can give you a simple example of that. I'm sure you've been through this kind of thing. You may have an experience or something that happens in your life where you feel a certain emotion. Let's suppose you feel, I don't know, someone insulted you or someone did something that hurt you or made you feel bad or low. And now you have this emotion, and then you have to try to figure out what to do with this emotion. Maybe you even start thinking, should I be feeling this way? Maybe I should just brush it off. I shouldn't feel so insulted. Who cares about what that person said about me? Or maybe you might start thinking, no, it's important. I need to do something. Okay, then that filters into action again. But just sticking with controlling your emotions. One of the ways we use reason is to try to control our emotions, right? Am I feeling too much resentment? Why am I resenting this? Maybe it's really about something in the past. Maybe I shouldn't care about this. Maybe I should care about this. How should I deal with my emotions? Okay, well, if you're doing that with reason, then you're using reason in an applied manner. You're using reason not just to know truth for its own sake, but you're using reason to try to figure out how to control your emotions or what to do with your emotions or whether to maybe take a certain action based on your deliberations. So again, Aristotle thinks that these two uses of reason are very different. They both involve reason, they both involve the mind, they involve intelligence, thought, thinking, right? So because that's what rationality engages in, is thought, reflection, trying to understand, trying to know. But one's pure. The pure one is, I'm just using reason to know, period, end of story. The other practical reason is when you use reason to try to figure out what to do or how to feel or whether you should be feeling a certain way. So I hope the difference between theoretical, or what Aristotle calls the pure use of reason, the difference between theoretical reason and practical reason is clear. Now, you may have some questions about that, but we're going to march right along. It follows from the fact that there are two uses of reason, it follows that there are two branches of virtue. Okay? Because again, we said that human virtue, according to Aristotle, he thinks he's figured this out based upon his function argument. According to Aristotle, the function of a human being is to engage in rational activity. What is rational? The function of a human being is to engage in rational activity, and a good life, a virtuous life, would involve having those character traits which cause you to live a rational life well and on a regular basis. Okay, so now we've said that there's two uses of reason. So it's going to follow that there are two branches of virtue. There's intellectual virtue, and there's also practical virtue. Now, both are important because both are parts of human virtue. And you need both in order to be a virtuous human. But one of the questions we'll get to, not today, but later on, I hope, another time, is of the two branches of virtue, which one, if any, is more important than the other? So think about that. And we'll get to what Aristotle has to say about that another time. But what we need to do, what we're going to do in the remaining minutes of this class, is we're going to talk a little more about intellectual virtue itself, okay? Intellectual virtue has to do with developing those traits. And in the case of intellectual virtue, as I say on the handout, it's what we might call habits of the mind. There are certain habits of the mind. Any character trait involves a habitual way of acting, okay? A habit is not necessarily a bad thing. Aristotle would say that human beings are creatures of habit. That's just the way we are. We are creatures of habit. You get into a pattern of doing certain things, and then that becomes a character trait that you generally act on. Okay, another way of thinking about a character trait is that it's a disposition to behave or to think in a certain way. So Aristotle would say that intellectual virtue consists in those character traits or habits of the mind, which, if you have them, are going to make you an excellent knowledge seeker, knowledge gainer on a regular basis. Okay, everybody, every so often, is able to grasp a truth here and there. But some people have developed their mind in such a way that they have good mental habits. And these mental habits allow them to exercise the function of a human being properly, specifically the function of using reason in its pure function, in its pure use, okay? Again, using reason in its pure or theoretical manner is using reason to gain knowledge for its own sake, without any reference to any possible, action or controlling some emotion, like we said before. So the catch-all name for theoretical virtue is theoretical wisdom, okay? Wisdom is a virtue. Everybody, well, most people would agree that wisdom is a virtue. Well, according to Aristotle, when they're coming up with a certain perspective on what wisdom is, okay? Wisdom is a theoretical virtue. It consists in a whole bunch of qualities, and I have some of them on the sheet here, and there may be others, okay? Wisdom is the basic theoretical virtue. A wise person is someone who has those mental habits, those habits of the mind, those character traits that enable him or her to be an excellent knowledge seeker, knowledge gainer on a regular basis, to do it well and on a regular basis. Okay, so for example, I have a list of theoretical virtues. All of these are grouped under the general category of wisdom. And maybe some people have some of these more than they have others, and others, have different ones. Maybe very few people have all of these qualities to the max, okay? But if you look at the list I have there, for example, first of all, well, these two sort of go hand in hand, and these character traits overlap, okay? They're not, it's hard to define some of these without getting into a definition of the others, but let's talk about curiosity, okay? Curiosity is one of the intellectual virtues. I say that because curiosity, if you have curiosity, you're going to be a better knowledge seeker than if you lack curiosity, okay? Wonder is sort of that that sense of amazement about the world and a sort of questioning. You see it sometimes, especially in children, but some people, they don't lose it when they grow up either. They have a sense of wonder about the world. Actually, Aristotle says that philosophy begins with wonder. So the sense of, like, for example, a child, looks out the window and it, says, oh, the sky is blue and the grass is green. Why is the sky blue? Why is the grass green? What is it that makes the world be the way it is? Okay, that sense of wonder is an intellectual virtue. It's part of wisdom, because if you have it, you're going to be a better knowledge seeker than if you don't. Unfortunately, some people start off as children being curious and having a lot of wonder about the world, and then as they grow up, they sort of become jaded and not interested in knowing about why the world is the way it is. And other people somehow don't lose that sense of wonder about the world. Now let's move on with the list. We have critical thinking. Okay, critical thinking is a character trait or a mental habit. Critical thinking means something like, being logical and looking at an argument, or looking at, if someone says, hey, this is why people are getting cancer, or whatever the case may be, this is why people are angry in this country, it's because of this. And then, somebody just says, oh yeah, I guess you're right. And they don't think about it critically. Like, critical thinking means looking at an argument or looking at a claim, reading other people's stuff or hearing what other people say, and asking yourself, is that really true? Does that person really know what they're talking about? They've given me an argument. What is the argument? Is it a good argument? So the ability to engage in critical thinking is definitely a theoretical virtue, and it's part of wisdom. Creativity, moving down the list here, we have creativity. A creative person is a person who, let's say, thinks of new ways of looking at the world. The great geniuses of the past, Einstein, Galileo, were people who were able to, as we say today, think outside the box, right? Some people, they're just sort of, they have blinders on, and they just, all their assumptions that they've been taught all their life, they don't question, or they don't think outside the box, so to speak. They don't think, well, maybe the world is different than we thought it was, okay? Or maybe this is why, light works the way it does, or maybe this is the construction of the cosmos rather than that. Galileo and Copernicus coming along and saying, well, maybe the Earth is not at the center of the universe, maybe the sun is at the center of the solar system. And, so basically the idea of creativity is, I guess you could say it's hard to define creativity without just, using some other word in its place, but to be a creative thinker is to think in new ways, unpredictable ways, to have a fresh approach. That is also a part of theoretical wisdom, because if you're creative, and this relates next, well, let's just go on to open-mindedness, okay? An open-minded person is a person who says, I think I know certain things, but maybe I'm wrong. If someone comes into the room and says, hey, you've been thinking this for a while, and how about maybe this is true? Maybe you've been looking at this wrong the whole, your whole life. Well, an open-minded person is going to say, well, I'll consider that. I'm not necessarily sticking to my beliefs because maybe they're wrong, or maybe some of them are wrong. So being open-minded, self-criticality, being the ability to criticize your own views, to sort of examine your own views, intellectual humility. I'm just, again, reading the list here. Intellectual humility is related to self-criticality. If you're an arrogant person intellectually, then you think you know everything, then it's not likely that you're going to discover new truths, because chances are you're mistaken about some of the things that you believe, and you could be wrong. And so therefore, intellectual humility is a virtue of the mind. And I will say, I have last on this list, persistence, or intellectual persistence, okay? In other words, to be a truth seeker sometimes takes a kind of determination to follow an argument through. Like if you get lazy when you're reading, then you're not going to be very critical. So, I mean, that kind of relates to critical thinking. But persistence means, let's suppose you have a research project, you're trying to figure something out. And, to not give up and not give in and to say, okay, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. This may be hard, this may be difficult, but I'm going to try to understand this. I'm going to stick with it, stick-to-itiveness, okay, and a kind of intellectual stick-to-itiveness. That is what we mean by persistence in this context. So now there may be, this list is not meant to be complete. Again, the general word that we're going to use to describe theoretical virtue is wisdom. And what is wisdom? According to Aristotle, wisdom doesn't necessarily mean knowing a lot. It means having those qualities which will enable you to know a lot. So if you're a wise person, you have these qualities, which may take time, no question. It does take time to develop and work on these aspects: curiosity, wonder, critical thinking. I mean, maybe some of these are more sort of inborn and some of these are more taught or cultivated. These virtues, these qualities are all necessary for being an excellent knowledge seeker, knowledge gainer. And therefore, they are all part of the intellectual or theoretical virtue of wisdom. Now, one of the things I'm gonna draw this to a close shortly. We've been going on for over an hour, but next time we're going to talk about practical virtue in more detail, a lot more detail. What is practical virtue? What's involved in controlling your actions and emotions with reason? How do you do that? Aristotle is going to come up with some guideline about how to do that, and there's going to be a list of practical virtues, okay? And we'll get to that next time. Before I get to that, I want to say just a little bit more about the fact, I mentioned this before, that according to Aristotle, human beings are creatures of habit. This is a very important point. Human beings are creatures of habit. Now, habits have a lot to do with your upbringing. Okay, if you are brought up in a certain place with certain parents or teachers, you're going to cultivate certain habits to a large extent based upon who your teachers and your parents were, what kind of things you learned as a child, right? So what Aristotle would say is that virtue, whether it's practical or theoretical, the cultivation of virtue is something that depends a lot on upbringing, on education, because any habit can be instilled or encouraged in you by your peers, your teachers, your parents, your authority figures. Any habit that you may have could be, to a large extent, a result of your background upbringing, right? So Aristotle would say that whether we develop the virtues or not, including the theoretical virtues, is going to depend upon a lot on who our teachers and parents are. Because parents, good parents, virtuous teachers, will help a student, a pupil, a disciple, a child, to cultivate the virtues. Bad parents, bad teachers will actually make a student get the vices. Okay, so for example, if a child expresses curiosity and wonder about the world, and the parent says, oh, stop asking that stupid question, why is the sky blue? Just, shut up and just go watch TV, or, I don't want to talk to you about this question you have. That would be discouraging the child from having curiosity and wonder. And if you're brought up in that situation, you may end up not being curious. You sort of got a bad taste in your mouth for asking questions. Okay, open-mindedness can be encouraged, cultivated in a child or a student or in a disciple. or it could be encouraged, or it could be squelched. So creativity can be fostered. It can also be tamped down. Okay, when a student speaks in a classroom and they're talking outside the box, and the professor says, "Oh, I don't want to hear that because that's off the pale," then that discourages being creative to some degree. Okay, maybe that's not a perfect example, but because sometimes people do raise points that, okay, well, that's interesting, but let's not talk about that now. Maybe sometimes a proper response depending upon the situation, but. The main point I'm trying to make here is that the virtues, whether we're talking about intellectual virtues or talking about practical virtues, the virtues can be encouraged, cultivated. They take time to cultivate. They take practice. You can get better at them. You can lose them. For all of the qualities we have on this list, there's going to be opposites. A lack of creativity, closed-mindedness, unself-criticality, intellectual arrogance. There's going to be opposites. Those would be vices. But my main point right now is that habits of the mind and habits of the heart, as we'll get into more when we talk about practical virtue, can be encouraged, cultivated, developed over time, perfected. The more you have these character traits down, the more of the more of a virtuous person you are. Okay, still a lot to talk about with Aristotle. We have to talk about practical virtue some more. We still have to talk about what is the relationship between virtue and happiness. So that's going to be another topic that we still have to get into, as well as some other issues with Aristotle. So we're still doing Aristotle for, I would say, at least 2 more times. We do want to get on to St. Thomas Aquinas after that. In the meantime, until next time, have a good day or a good week until I see you next time. All the best.